All right, here we are with Chapter 2 of Meg of Heron's Neck by Elizabeth Ladd, illustrated by Mary Stevens. Copyright 1961 by Elizabeth Ladd. Chapter 2, The Sea Mouse. The afternoon sun stood on the very edge of the Summerport Mountains, and a golden haze hung over the harbor as the Dovekey landed the last of her passengers. Only a few people still lingered on the runways and decks as mild summer evening approached. The float was deserted by fishermen. Ellen yawned and stretched. Well, this day is over, and tomorrow is Sunday. Here's some money, Meg. Run uptown and get something to eat. I'll be over to Oil Wharf, gassing up. Meet me there. Meg shoved those bills into the pocket of her jeans. What shall I get? Alan rubbed his nose. Get a steak, 2 big ones, and bread and lettuce. I guess everything else is aboard the Mouse, and tomorrow we'll buy lobsters. It's either feast or famine with us. Meg ran up the runway and onto the wharf. She was not sorry at being able to run and jump after sitting still for a couple of hours. Boats were nice, but they were certainly limited in space. The main street of Summerport was almost empty. Most of the people had gone home to supper. The sun still peeped through an opening between 2 mountains and touched the tops of the brick buildings, turning them a warm, ruddy color. But the street below was already in cool shadows. Meg made her purchases quickly. They would eat well tonight. What they ate depended a lot on what Alan happened to be earning. With a good job aboard the Dovekey, they lived on steak and lobster, but in the winter, when jobs were scarce on the water, they often lived on bread and on clams, which Alan dug himself. Of course, Alan could usually get a job on a scallop dragger. He was quick and strong and able with boats. But since Megan had come to live with him, he usually drifted out of the towns in the fall and lived aboard the Sea Mouse in some lonely or less frequented cove during the winter. There they existed on what remained of his summer earnings, or from what he could pick up by digging the clams or doing a few hours' work at odd jobs, such as repairing a skiff for someone. Meg had a handful of change left over when her purchases were paid for, and she headed at once for the drugstore soda fountain. It never would have dawned on Meg to save the change, nor would her brother have expected her to do so. Alan freely spent what he had and went without when there was nothing left to spend. After the soda, Meg spent the rest of the money on candy bars. She stuffed them into the bag with the groceries and then set out for the dock, where the Dovekey was having gasoline pumped into her fuel tanks. The sun was setting. Even the gulls that wheeled over the almost deserted harbor were slow and sleepy. Alan was ready to cast off by the time Meg reached the dock. Come on, slowpoke, he said. I'll drop you and Pulsive off at the Mouse and then take the Dovekey to her mooring. As Meg hopped aboard, he added, There's a present for you down in the cabin. Meg put down her bundles and ran into the cabin. Presents were rare in the Elwell family. In the center of the cabin floor stood a good-sized cardboard box, and from it came strange rasping and rustling noises. As she looked, a huge coal-black bill appeared in a crack in the cover and pushed strongly at the cardboard. Meg stared. What is it? She shouted. A tame crow, her brother shouted back. Open the box. Cautiously, Meg untied the string that held the cover down. Out popped a stout black bill surrounded by bristles, much like stiff black whiskers, and then she saw a pair of bright gray eyes, evilly intelligent. The bill flew open, showing an enormous pink throat from which came a terrible clamor. The black cat, Repulsive, fled in terror. "Goodness," Meg cried, "you can see all the way to his toes." "He's hungry," Alan shouted down to her. "Drop a piece of bread into his mouth." Meg dug into the loaf of bread, tore off a bit, and dropped it into the pink cavern. The bill closed. "Gobble, gobble," said the crow. Then he was silent and stared at her in a critical fashion. "We're home now," Alan shouted. "Pack him back into the box. Get him aboard the mouse." "Yar!" shouted the crow as Meg shoved him down in the box. "Yar!" He tried to bite her. The sea mouse didn't have a regular mooring like the Dovekey and most of the harbor boats. Alan had permission to keep his boat tied beside a part of an old wharf that was falling into ruin and was no longer used. You could board the sea mouse from the land side, but the wharf was so shaky, with so many broken and missing planks, that it was easier and certainly safer to approach from the water. Now he ran the Dovekey in beside the smaller sea mouse and unloaded his passengers and freight. Meg pushed the crow's box aboard their own boat and dropped the bag of groceries aboard too. She had to drag Repulsive out from under the bunk where he had hidden after the first squall from the crow. Last of all, Megan herself climbed aboard the sea mouse. "All ashore that's going ashore," Alan called, and swung the Dovekey clear of the old wharf, heading it out to its mooring in the harbor. The sea mouse wasn't much to look at. It was short and chunky and in need of painting, above the waterline anyway. Alan always kept the bottom of the boat tight. There was a cabin on deck, much like the one on the Dovekey, but smaller, and minus the mahogany and brass. Then you went down a couple of steps to a tiny galley, hardly large enough to turn around in, with a small stove, which could burn wood or coal, and with cupboards for the dishes and the few supplies. Beyond the galley there was an inside cabin, really a little bedroom built in the very bow of the boat. There was a bunk on either wall, and above each bunk a small round portal let in a ray of light. When you went to sleep at night, you had the whole curve of the ship's prow over your bed. By the time the clink of oars told that Alan was returning in the skiff, Meg had a fire going in the stove and the food unwrapped. She was starving, and for a moment she thought of eating some of the candy bars. Alan never complained about her eating candy before meals, but the food smelled so good she decided to wait. It was marvelous to be hungry and know you had plenty of food all around you waiting to be cooked. The sunset was ending as Alan came aboard. The glow faded out of the sky, and only the topmost cloud still held a faint flush of color. A pinpoint of light appeared, the lighthouse on the outer edge of Summerport Harbor. Alan washed briefly in a small enamel basin. "Got the fire going, good girl? I'm so hungry. I could eat that crow." Meg salted and peppered the steaks and then put them on a board well beyond the reach of the cat. Repulsive had regained his courage now that the crow had been put back into his box. Alan set the coffee pot on a corner of the stove. "Feed the cat," he said. "Maybe that will keep him away from those steaks." Meg opened a can of cat food with a little wall can opener. "Where did you get the crow?" she asked. "The feller that runs the gas pumps had him. He's a young one. They took him out of the nest this summer and made a pet out of him. But the feller's wife took a disliking to him, and he had to get rid of him. I thought you might like him, but I suspect it was a mistake." "Why? I do like him. I'm going to name him Crow." "I don't mean that. A crow can be an unholy nuisance. I don't know what we'll ever do with him, cooped up here aboard the mouse. And the cat hates him already. Meg put the food down for Repulsive. You could build a pen for him tomorrow Sunday so you won't have to go out on excursions. Repulsive will get used to him. I bet I could train him to do all sorts of tricks. Alan flipped the steaks into the sizzling frying pan. The hot, sweet smell of cooking meat filled the evening air. Alan yawned. It slapped at a mosquito. Trying to give you a sound effect there. And the hot, sweet smell of cooking meat filled that evening air. Yes, backwards here. This is the life, he said as he made his way into the galley, looking out over the darkening harbor. Fog will be in thick enough to cut by morning. You can see it laying out there now. Well, let it. It suits me. The meal was simple but good. Thick slices of bread heavy with butter and plain lettuce. Steak and hot coffee made up the fare. Meg drank coffee with her brother. Alan always let her do it. She fed the crumbs of her steak to Repulsive, who lay heavily across her knees. Darkness closed in, and the light at the end of the harbor vanished under the creeping fog. A bird called out of the darkness, a harsh and lonely croak. Blue Heron, Alan said in a low voice, the tide's ebbing. He's looking for his supper. There were, of course, no electric lights. Aboard the Sea Mouse, Alan lit the small kerosene lantern and hung it up in the galley. It gave just about enough light for them to find their way around the tiny cubbyhole. They rinsed the dishes off with the hot water that remained in the tea kettle. There was never any elaborate dishwashing aboard the Sea Mouse. Meg looked into the box. The crow was asleep, his head under his wing. He grumbled a little at the intrusion and then went back to sleep. Alan threw himself down on his bunk and lit a cigarette. I'm not sorry tomorrow's Sunday, he said. Repulsive climbed onto the bunk with him. The only place the black cat wanted to lie down was on Alan's chest. One caveat here. Cigarette smoking is not good for your health. Now listen along as I read. This is my first reading of this book, so I hope you're enjoying it. Anyway, as Repulsive the cat climbed onto the bunk with Alan, the only place that black cat wanted to lie down was on Alan's chest, and he needed his claws into the thin shirt. Alan pushed him down, and Repulsive climbed up again, on Alan's face this time. It was one of the reasons he was named Repulsive. Alan pushed him away, blew that cigarette smoke into his face, as Repulsive glared and stalked over to Megan's bunk. Meg peeped out the cabin doorway. Raw, cold fog, heavy with the scent of the sea, left beads of moisture all over the exposed woodwork. Not a speck of light could be seen in the blackness. She was glad to creep back into the cozy little inner cabin. She removed her sneakers and sat on the edge of her bunk, wiggling her toes. She wondered if she should wash her feet and then decided against it. There was no more hot water. I need new sneakers, she told her brother. There's nothing left of these but the soles. You're harder on shoes than any kid I ever saw, Alan growled, but not unkindly. Next week it'll be Labor Day, and you know what happens after that. This town will be deader than a doornail. No more excursion work after that. Where are we going this fall? Meg asked. Stay in Summerport, maybe, her brother answered. Guess I could get a job on one of the scallop draggers. Meg sat upright on her bunk, pushing Repulsive aside. We can't do that, Alan. I'd have to go to school. Her voice was sharp with alarm. Alan crushed out a cigarette. Maybe you should go to school, he said uneasily. After all, how are you ever going to learn to read? No, Meg cried. I won't go to school. I can read good now. I can read most all the comic books you bring home. You know what happened the last time I went to school. She began to sniffle loudly. Alan knew only too well. It had been the fall Meg first came to live aboard the Sea Mouse. She had started school then. She had been in the 3rd grade, but something had gone wrong. He wasn't very sure just what it was. Meg had cried all the time and said she hated the school and hated the teacher. Alan never could find out just what happened, but sometimes he wondered if the other children had laughed at her clothes. She had not had any dresses to wear. It had ended with their leaving town and taking the Sea Mouse to a very lonely strip of coast, where few people saw Meg or wondered much about her. If any questions were asked, they moved somewhere else. Meg became adept at avoiding inquisitive folks, and it soon seemed quite usual to her that in the winter life should be lonely and quiet, and that in the summer it should be busy and noisy. Well, that's the end of chapter 2. We'll come back for chapter 3 in the next video. Hope you like it.